There's no reason to read the will anymore, my daughter-in-law said as she slid a stack of papers across the mahogany conference table. Harold already transferred everything into my name months ago. The room went silent so fast I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner above us. I stared at Vanessa without blinking, certain I had misunderstood her. My husband had been gone for only 12 days. 12 days since I stood beside his grave in the cold March rain while people pressed sympathetic hands against my shoulders and promised to check on me. 12 days since I watched the casket disappear beneath the earth after 43 years of marriage. And now I was sitting in a polished downtown law office while my daughter-in-law smiled like she had just announced good news at a family dinner. Ethan sat beside her, stiff and pale, his eyes fixed on the table instead of me. That hurt more than Vanessa's words. My son had always hated conflict. Even as a child, he would leave the room whenever voices got too loud. But this wasn't an argument over burnt turkey at Thanksgiving or politics at Christmas dinner. This was my life. My home. My marriage. Mr. Collins, Harold's attorney for nearly 30 years, adjusted his glasses slowly. He looked uncomfortable in a way I had never seen before. Vanessa, he said carefully, perhaps we should still review the documents. There's nothing to review, she replied smoothly. Harold updated everything after his surgery last fall. The house, the investment accounts, the vacation property in Vermont. It's all legally mine now. I folded my hands tightly in my lap to stop them from trembling. Outside the office window, Chicago traffic moved normally beneath a gray afternoon sky. People crossed the street carrying coffee cups and grocery bags, while my entire world quietly collapsed inside a conference room on the 23rd floor. Harold had built our life carefully over 4 decades. Every room in our lakefront home carried some piece of him. The brass reading lamp beside his chair. The cedar shelves he installed himself in the library. The grandfather clock he wound every Sunday evening without fail. He used to joke that if he ever disappeared, the whole house would stop working out of protest. And now Vanessa was speaking about that life like she was discussing a business merger. Harold wanted things this way, she continued softly. He trusted me to manage everything. Ethan finally cleared his throat. Mom, Dad thought this would make things easier. Easier. I looked at my son, then really looked at him. At the dark circles under his eyes. At the nervous way he rubbed his wedding band with his thumb. He looked exhausted. Smaller somehow. Vanessa reached over and touched his arm gently, almost possessively. The movement was subtle, but I noticed it. I noticed everything now. Mr. Collins opened the folder in front of him with visible hesitation. Margaret, he said quietly, there are some documents you should probably see. Vanessa's smile tightened for the first time that afternoon. And in that single moment, something cold settled deep inside me. Because suddenly I understood this wasn't grief speaking. This wasn't confusion after a funeral. This had been planned long before Harold died. The drive home felt longer than usual even though traffic was light along Lakeshore Drive. Ethan offered to drive me back to the house, but I told him I preferred to go alone. He nodded too quickly, almost with relief, and Vanessa gave me one of her polished little smiles before turning back toward the elevator with her hand resting lightly against his back. I watched them disappear without another word. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the late afternoon sun had faded behind heavy clouds, leaving the house wrapped in a dull gray silence. Harold always turned the porch light on before sunset. Even after retirement, he kept that habit like clockwork. Seeing the front steps dark made something tighten painfully inside my chest. I unlocked the door and stepped into the foyer slowly, half expecting to hear his voice from the den or the soft sound of jazz drifting from the kitchen radio. Instead, there was nothing. Just silence and the faint scent of Vanessa's expensive floral perfume lingering in the air. She had been there earlier. I could tell immediately. The framed wedding photo of Harold and me that normally sat on the entry table had been moved several inches to the side beside a tall vase of white lilies she brought after the funeral. I stood there staring at it longer than I should have. 43 years together reduced to a decorative inconvenience. I slipped off my coat and walked toward the kitchen. The refrigerator door was covered with neat handwritten labels now. Pantry inventory. Weekly meal plan. Cleaning schedule. Vanessa's handwriting. Every surface looked strangely organized, almost staged, like a model home waiting for strangers to tour it. Harold hated clutter, but he also hated formality inside a family home. He used to leave newspapers folded beside his chair and coffee mugs half-finished on the counter. Little signs that someone actually lived there. Now the kitchen looked untouched. Sterile. Controlled. I opened the cabinet where we kept the good bourbon Harold saved for special evenings. Locked. I stared at the small silver lock for several seconds before quietly closing the cabinet again. Upstairs things felt worse. The master bedroom door was partially open, and when I stepped inside I immediately noticed my lavender armchair missing from the corner near the windows. The knitted blanket my sister gave me last Christmas was gone too. My closet door stood slightly ajar, and several of my dresses had been pushed tightly to one side to make room for empty hangers. Empty hangers. I sat slowly on the edge of the bed, my eyes fixed on Harold's reading glasses still resting on the nightstand exactly where he left them 2 weeks ago. Everything else was changing around me so quickly it made my head spin, but those glasses remained untouched, almost forgotten in the middle of Vanessa's careful rearranging. Downstairs, I heard the front door open followed by quiet footsteps. Ethan. Mom, he called softly. I did not answer right away. A moment later he appeared in the doorway looking exhausted. His tie hung loose around his collar, and there was a deep crease between his eyebrows Harold used to get whenever something troubled him. Vanessa thought it might be easier if we started organizing some things now, he said. Carefully. Organizing. Such a harmless word. I looked toward the half-empty closet again. I see. He shifted uncomfortably. She is only trying to help. I almost laughed at that, but the sound died before it reached my throat. Ethan stepped farther into the room. Mom, maybe it would be good for you to think about downsizing eventually. This house is a lot for one person. There it was. Not even 2 weeks after the funeral. I folded my hands tightly together in my lap and looked past him toward the darkening windows. Somewhere downstairs, a clock chimed 6 slow times through the silent house. And for the first time since Harold died, I no longer felt like a widow inside my own home. I felt like a guest waiting to be asked to leave. Sleep became impossible after that conversation with Ethan. Around 2 in the morning, I found myself sitting alone in the kitchen wearing Harold's old navy cardigan over my nightgown, staring at the soft yellow light above the stove. The house creaked quietly around me as the wind pushed against the windows from the lake. For years those sounds had comforted me. Harold used to joke that old houses talked at night if you listened carefully enough. But now every sound felt unfamiliar, like I was spending the night inside someone else's memory. I wrapped both hands around a mug of untouched tea, and tried to make sense of everything that had happened over the past few months. Grief has a strange way of blurring time. Days fold into each other until small details disappear. But sitting there in the silence, pieces slowly began drifting back to me. Little moments I had ignored because I trusted the people around me. Moments that suddenly felt different now. Last October, after Harold's second surgery, Vanessa started visiting almost every day. First I appreciated it. She brought groceries, organized medications, and spoke to doctors with calm confidence whenever I became overwhelmed. Ethan was traveling frequently for work then, and Vanessa stepped into every space before anyone even asked her to. I remember thinking how lucky we were to have such devoted family nearby. But eventually something shifted. Harold became quieter whenever she entered the room. Not afraid exactly, just guarded. One afternoon I walked into his study carrying soup and found the two of them sitting together at his desk surrounded by paperwork. Vanessa immediately closed a folder the moment she saw me. Harold forced a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Just insurance forms, she said lightly before I could ask anything. At the time I believed her. Another memory surfaced. Thanksgiving. Harold barely touched his food that evening, which was unusual because he loved Thanksgiving dinner more than any holiday meal. Halfway through dessert, he suddenly asked Ethan to help him carry boxes down to the basement. The request felt odd because Harold had not been strong enough to lift anything heavier than 10 pounds after surgery. I offered to help instead, but Vanessa interrupted almost immediately. "Let the men handle it," she said with a laugh while placing another scoop of mashed potatoes onto Ethan's plate. 20 minutes later, Harold returned upstairs looking pale and exhausted. His hands shook so badly he spilled gravy onto the tablecloth. Later that night, when I asked if he felt all right, he simply stared out the bedroom window toward the lake and said, "Promise me you will always pay attention to what people do when they think you are not looking." At the time, I thought the medication was making him emotional. Now those words echoed through my head with terrifying clarity. Around 3 in the morning, I finally stood and walked quietly toward Harold's study downstairs. The door was locked. That stopped me cold because Harold never locked that room from me. Ever. I touched the brass doorknob slowly, remembering how many nights I used to find him inside balancing account ledgers by hand even after computers made that unnecessary. He trusted paper more than technology. "Paper tells the truth," he always said. I looked down at the narrow strip of light beneath the door and realized someone had been inside recently. A faint scent of Vanessa's perfume drifted from the room. My chest tightened. I stepped back into the hallway and glanced toward the staircase leading upstairs where Ethan and Vanessa were sleeping. In the guest suite. Then I looked back at the locked study door again. The silence inside the house no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. And for the first time since Harold died, I began wondering whether my husband had spent his final months trying to warn me about something I had completely failed to see. The next morning, the house smelled like fresh coffee and cinnamon oatmeal when I came downstairs, but instead of comfort, the scent only made me uneasy. Vanessa stood at the kitchen island wearing cream-colored slacks and one of my old aprons tied neatly around her waist as if she belonged there more than I did. Sunlight poured through the windows behind her, catching the gold bracelet on her wrist while she flipped through paperwork spread carefully across the marble countertop. She smiled the moment she saw me. "Good morning, Margaret. I made breakfast." Her voice sounded warm, gentle, almost affectionate. Anyone outside our family would have thought she was the perfect daughter-in-law caring for a grieving widow. Ethan sat at the table scrolling through emails on his phone without looking up. I noticed there was only one mug beside the coffee pot. Vanessa poured herself a cup but did not offer me one. The omission was small enough to deny if mentioned. That was her talent. Every insult arrived wrapped in politeness. "I thought today we could start discussing practical things," she said while smoothing one of the documents flat against the counter. "There is just so much to organize after a loss like this." I opened the cabinet for another mug and realized several shelves had already been rearranged overnight. My dishes were stacked lower now while Vanessa's modern white plates sat at eye level. Tiny changes. Quiet changes. The kind designed to make someone slowly feel displaced without ever being able to point to one specific offense. "Mr. Collins called late yesterday," I said carefully as I filled my cup. Vanessa's hand paused for less than a second before she resumed sorting papers. "Did he?" she replied lightly. "Probably just legal cleanup." Ethan finally looked up then, but only briefly. "Vanessa has been handling most of the paperwork already," he added. "Dad trusted her with financial stuff near the end." Near the end. I hated that phrase. It reduced Harold's entire life into a fading final chapter everyone else seemed eager to close. I carried my coffee toward the breakfast nook overlooking the lake. Outside, thin sheets of rain moved across the water while bare tree branches bent in the wind. Harold used to sit in that exact chair every morning reading the newspaper aloud and complaining about property taxes. The memory hit so sharply I had to steady my hand against the table. Vanessa walked over holding a slim blue folder. "Actually," she said softly, "there is something else we should discuss." She slid the folder toward me with manicured fingers. Inside were brochures for senior living communities north of the city. Bright smiling couples stood in gardens and fitness centers beneath cheerful slogans about simplified lifestyles and maintenance-free living. For a moment I simply stared at the pages without speaking. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Vanessa lowered herself into the chair across from me and folded her hands neatly together. "This house is honestly too much responsibility now," she explained. "The stairs, the property taxes, the maintenance on the lakefront. Harold worried about that." I looked at Ethan. "Did your father tell you that?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck before answering. "Dad just wanted you taken care of, Mom." Taken care of. Another harmless phrase that somehow felt crueler than honesty. Vanessa leaned slightly closer, her expression calm and sympathetic. "We all want what is best for you." Her perfume drifted across the table again, soft floral notes filling the air where Harold's pipe tobacco scent used to linger every morning. I closed the folder slowly. Then I noticed something beside Vanessa's elbow. A set of keys. Brass keys attached to Harold's old leather keychain. Study keys. My eyes lifted toward her face, but her expression never changed. She followed my gaze calmly before placing her hand over the keys. "Oh," she said with a small smile. "I have been sorting through Harold's office upstairs. There were sensitive financial documents inside." Felt the room grow strangely still around me. Even the rain outside seemed quieter somehow. Harold had trusted very few people with that office. In 43 years he had never once locked me out of it. But Vanessa was not just entering that room now. She was claiming authority over it. And judging by the look on Ethan's face, he was going to let her. That afternoon the rain finally stopped, leaving the lake outside dull and silver beneath a heavy sky. Ethan left for a meeting downtown shortly after lunch, and Vanessa disappeared upstairs carrying another stack of folders pressed tightly against her chest. I waited until I heard the study door close before setting my untouched teacup into the sink. The house had become strangely quiet again, but it was no longer the peaceful quiet Harold loved. This silence felt careful, controlled, like every room was listening. I stood in the foyer for a long moment staring toward the staircase. Then I walked upstairs slowly, one hand sliding along the polished wooden railing Harold refinished himself 20 years earlier. Halfway up, I noticed fresh scuff marks near the study entrance as if boxes had recently been dragged across the floor. Vanessa was moving things, rearranging things, erasing things. The study door stood closed at the end of the hallway. For decades that room smelled faintly of cedar, old paper and Harold's aftershave. I used to bring him coffee there late at night while he balanced ledgers by hand beneath the warm yellow desk lamp. He always claimed numbers made more sense after midnight. Now I stood outside the door like a stranger afraid to knock. I reached for the handle carefully. Locked again. My reflection stared back at me from the dark brass knob. Tired eyes. Pale skin. A woman who suddenly looked older than 68. I almost turned away. Then I heard footsteps behind me. "Vanessa." "Oh," she said pleasantly, stopping several feet away. "I did not realize you were up here." She wore soft beige cashmere and held a tablet against her side like a business executive arriving for a meeting. Everything about her remained perfectly composed. Even her sympathy looked rehearsed. "I was looking for Harold's fountain pen," I said quietly. "He usually kept it in his desk drawer." Vanessa smiled with gentle patience. "I packed away most of the office supplies already. There were sensitive financial papers mixed in with everything." Again with that phrase. Sensitive financial papers. As though repeating it often enough made the room belong to her. "I can organize the study myself," I replied. Her smile tightened almost invisibly. "Margaret, honestly, I think this process may be emotionally overwhelming for you right now." The hallway fell silent between us. Somewhere downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed softly. I studied her face carefully then. The smooth confidence. The calm tone. The way she always spoke to me now like someone managing a fragile situation instead of speaking to family. "Did Harold ask you to take over his office before he died?" I asked. Vanessa held my gaze without blinking. "Harold trusted me completely. Not yes. Not no. Just another polished sentence that slid around the truth without touching it." She stepped closer and lowered her voice slightly. "You should really rest more. Stress is not good for blood pressure at your age." At your age. The words landed softly, but they still landed. I nodded once and stepped aside as if surrendering the hallway to her. Vanessa unlocked the study door with Harold's keychain and disappeared inside before quietly shutting it behind her. A few seconds later I heard filing cabinets opening, papers shifting, drawers sliding closed. I stood there listening longer than I should have. Then my eyes drifted toward the small built-in bookshelf beside the study entrance. Harold always hid spare keys in ridiculous places because he claimed real thieves never looked anywhere obvious. Once he tucked an emergency house key inside an old dictionary for nearly 6 years and forgot about it himself. Slowly, I walked toward the shelves and ran my fingers along the spines. Tax law, American history, Lake Michigan navigation charts. Then my hand stopped against a thick leather-bound atlas that looked slightly crooked compared to the others. I pulled it forward carefully. Something metallic slid loose behind it and dropped softly into my palm. A key. Small. Brass. Old. Not for the study door. Too narrow. I closed my fingers around it tightly while the sound of Vanessa moving papers continued behind the locked door. And suddenly, for the first time since the funeral, I felt something besides grief. I felt Harold reaching back toward me through the silence he left behind. I slipped the small brass key into my cardigan pocket and walked downstairs without making a sound. My pulse had started beating harder than it had in days, not from fear exactly, but from the strange certainty that Harold had wanted me to find it. The thought stayed with me through the rest of the afternoon, while Vanessa continued moving through the house upstairs like someone preparing a property for sale instead of mourning a family member. By evening, the temperature outside had dropped sharply. Wind rattled the windows overlooking the lake, and faint waves crashed against the shoreline below the bluff. Ethan returned home just after 7 carrying takeout containers from an Italian restaurant downtown. Vanessa greeted him at the door with a soft kiss against his cheek, and immediately began discussing paperwork before he even removed his coat. "The realtor can probably come by Friday," she said casually while unpacking food onto plates. Realtor. The word settled heavily into the room. Ethan glanced toward me briefly before lowering his eyes again. "Maybe we should wait a little," he muttered. Vanessa smiled without looking at him. "Waiting only complicates things financially." I sat quietly at the dining table listening to silverware clink against china, while rain tapped softly against the windows again. Harold bought that dining table during our 2nd year of marriage, after saving for nearly 8 months. He used to run his hand proudly along the polished wood every Thanksgiving before guests arrived. Now Vanessa spread real estate brochures across it beside the breadsticks. At one point she looked toward me and asked, "Do you think you would prefer Florida or somewhere closer to the city for retirement living?" Her tone sounded thoughtful, helpful, as if she were asking about vacation plans instead of removing me from my own home. I folded my napkin carefully beside my plate. "I have not decided to leave." Vanessa took a slow sip of wine before answering. "Sometimes decisions are made for us by circumstances." Ethan said nothing. Not one word. That silence followed me long after dinner ended. Around 10 o'clock, the house finally grew quiet. I waited another hour before stepping out into the hallway. The guest suite door remained closed. No light underneath. Slowly, I walked downstairs toward the library at the far end of the first floor. Harold spent countless evenings there beside the fireplace reading biographies and old sailing magazines while jazz played softly through the speakers. The room smelled faintly of cedar smoke and dust now. Moonlight stretched pale across the carpet as I moved toward the antique roll-top desk built into the corner beside the shelves. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled open the bottom drawer. Locked. I stared at the narrow keyhole for several seconds before reaching into my pocket. The brass key slid inside perfectly. A quiet click echoed through the dark room. My breath caught. I opened the drawer slowly. Inside sat a small black lockbox alongside neatly stacked folders tied with blue ribbon. On top rested a single envelope with my name written across the front in Harold's handwriting. Margaret. Just seeing his handwriting again made my chest ache. I sat down carefully in the leather chair and opened the envelope with unsteady fingers. Inside was a short handwritten note dated 3 weeks before his death. Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I waited too long to tell you everything directly. I am sorry for that. There are things happening around us that do not feel right to me anymore. I need you to trust your instincts, even if doing so becomes painful. Some people show their true intentions only when they believe time is running out. My vision blurred for a moment. I pressed my fingertips against my eyes before continuing. Inside the lockbox beneath the letter were copies of financial records, bank statements, property documents, and several flash drives carefully labeled by month. Then I noticed one folder, separated from the others with a yellow tab attached to the corner. Across the tab, Harold had written 2 words in dark blue ink. Do not trust. My hand stayed frozen on the folder for several long seconds, while rain pressed softly against the library windows behind me. Do not trust. Harold had underlined the words twice. I looked back toward the staircase instinctively, half expecting footsteps, but the house remained silent. Slowly, I opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of financial transfers, account summaries, and legal forms with yellow sticky notes attached in Harold's handwriting. Several pages contained signatures that looked shaky and uneven compared to the precise signature I had watched Harold write for decades. One document showed ownership changes on the lake house completed only 9 days after his second surgery. Another listed power of attorney revisions filed during a week Harold had barely been awake because of medication. My chest tightened as I turned each page. Harold had noticed it too. He had known something was wrong. Tucked between the papers was a smaller sealed envelope marked "Open Last." I set it aside for the moment and reached for one of the flash drives instead. The old desktop computer still sat beneath the library shelves exactly where Harold left it. I inserted the drive carefully and waited while folders appeared across the screen organized by date. Audio recordings, bank statements, scanned letters. Then one file immediately caught my attention. November_14_private. Clicked it. For a moment there was only static. Then Harold's voice filled the dark library softly, tired and uneven but unmistakably his. I am recording this because I do not know who I can speak openly to anymore. I stopped breathing. If Margaret ever hears this, he continued slowly, I need her to understand that I never intended to remove her from anything. Never. My fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. In the recording, Harold sounded exhausted. Older somehow. Vanessa has been handling more paperwork lately while I recover. First I appreciated it. But documents keep appearing for signatures without explanation. Transfers. Account. Changes. I ask questions and suddenly I am treated like I am confused. He paused for several seconds, coughing quietly in the background. Then came the sentence that made my stomach drop. Yesterday I discovered money moved from our joint accounts without Margaret knowing. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the lake. I stared at the glowing computer screen while Harold's voice continued through the speakers. Ethan believes Vanessa is helping us. I do not think he understands what is happening. I tried speaking to him twice, but she always interrupts before we finish. His breathing sounded heavier near the end of the recording. If anything happens before I correct this legally, Margaret needs to trust Collins. And she needs to look inside the grandfather clock. The audio ended abruptly. I sat there in complete silence staring at the dark screen after the file closed itself. The grandfather clock. My eyes slowly drifted toward the hallway outside the library where the tall antique clock stood beside the staircase. Harold bought it during our 10th anniversary trip to Boston and spent years restoring every brass gear by hand. He wound it every Sunday evening without fail. No one else touched it. Ever. Suddenly I heard footsteps upstairs. Quick movement followed by a door opening. Vanessa. Instantly I removed the flash drive and slid the documents back into the lockbox. My pulse hammered so loudly I thought she might hear it downstairs. A moment later, soft footsteps crossed the hallway above me. Then silence again. I closed the drawer carefully and locked it before standing. The house no longer felt like a home filled with grief. Felt like a chessboard. Every conversation. Every missing document. Every polite smile from Vanessa suddenly carried a second meaning underneath it. I stepped into the hallway and looked toward the grandfather clock standing in the dim light near the staircase. Its steady ticking echoed quietly through the house. Slow. Patient. Waiting. And for the first time since Harold died, I realized he had not left me helpless. He had left me a trail. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and sat alone in the dark dining room listening to the grandfather clock tick through the silence. Every sound inside the house seemed sharper now. The refrigerator humming softly in the kitchen. Wind brushing tree branches against the windows overlooking the lake. Footsteps upstairs moving across floors Harold once walked every night before bed. I wrapped both hands around a cup of black coffee and stared at the clock near the staircase. Harold had hidden something there. I knew it with absolute certainty now. But I also knew Vanessa watched everything more carefully than I first realized. Around 8 o'clock, she came downstairs dressed for another meeting, carrying a leather planner against her side while speaking quietly into her phone about appraisals and listing timelines. Listing timelines. She ended the call the moment she noticed me watching her. "You are up early," she said pleasantly. I nodded once. Could not sleep. Vanessa crossed toward the kitchen and paused beside the grandfather clock briefly, adjusting the brass pendulum with familiar ease before continuing on. The movement stopped me cold. She knew the clock mattered too. My expression must not have changed because she smiled lightly before pouring herself coffee. "Harold always worried when the pendulum drifted off balance," she said. "He showed me how to fix it months ago." Months ago. Again that quiet reminder that she had inserted herself into every corner of Harold's life before he died. Ethan came downstairs a few minutes later looking exhausted. His tie hung loose around his neck, and there were deep shadows beneath his eyes now. He barely touched breakfast before Vanessa began discussing mortgage calculations and projected sale values for the property. She spoke efficiently, confidently, like someone already running a corporation she inherited. Ethan mostly listened in silence. At one point he glanced toward me and opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something. But Vanessa placed a hand gently on his arm before he could speak. "We only want stability for everyone," she said softly. Ethan lowered his eyes again. After they left for the city, the house fell silent once more. I waited nearly 20 minutes before walking toward the grandfather clock. Up close, I could see tiny scratches along the brass frame where Harold's fingertips had worn the finish smooth over decades. He treated this clock like a living thing. Every Sunday evening he opened the lower cabinet, wound the mechanism carefully, and listened to its rhythm afterward with quiet satisfaction. My fingers traced the carved wooden edge slowly until I noticed something unusual near the back panel. A small circular indentation barely visible beneath the brass hinge. I pressed it gently. A soft click echoed inside the clock. My breath caught. The lower compartment shifted open slightly farther than normal, revealing a narrow hidden space behind the pendulum housing. Inside rested a sealed envelope and a small silver flash drive wrapped in cloth. For several seconds I simply stared at them without moving. Harold had built this hiding place himself years ago, after becoming obsessed with antique restoration videos during retirement. I remembered laughing at him while sawdust covered the garage floor. "You are building secret compartments now?" I had teased. He smiled for hours afterward like a mischievous teenager. My throat tightened painfully at the memory. Slowly, I removed the envelope first. Across the front, written in Harold's careful handwriting, were 4 words. "Only if she wins." A chill moved through me despite the warmth inside the house. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a notarized letter signed by Harold only 6 days before his death, stating clearly that any transfers made under pressure or during periods of heavy medication did not reflect his true wishes. Attached beneath it was a second page containing detailed notes about missing funds, altered signatures, and meetings he claimed Vanessa insisted remain private. At the bottom, Harold had written one final sentence by hand. "If this letter is necessary, then I was right to be afraid." I stared at those words while the grandfather clock continued ticking steadily beside me. Then I heard tires crunching unexpectedly across the driveway outside. My head snapped toward the front windows. Vanessa's black Mercedes was pulling back into the garage. My heart slammed against my ribs as Vanessa's car disappeared beneath the garage door. For one sharp moment, panic almost took over. The hidden compartment inside the grandfather clock still stood partially open beside me, and Harold's envelope remained unfolded in my trembling hands. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Fast movements would only create mistakes. Harold always said people revealed themselves most clearly when they believed someone else was cornered. I carefully slid the notarized letter and silver flash drive into the pocket of my cardigan just as the mudroom door opened downstairs. Vanessa's heels clicked sharply across the kitchen tile. "Margaret," she called lightly. I closed the hidden compartment inside the clock, adjusted the pendulum back into place, and stepped calmly toward the foyer as though nothing unusual had happened. Vanessa appeared moments later carrying her phone and car keys. A faint crease touched her forehead when she saw me standing near the staircase. "I forgot my planner," she explained with a quick smile. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the grandfather clock before returning to me. "Just 1 second. But I noticed it." "You startled me," I said softly. "I thought you left already." "Long day ahead," she replied while studying my face carefully. "Too many moving parts right now." She walked toward the study entrance, then paused suddenly. "Did you need something from the clock?" The question came too smoothly to sound casual. I rested one hand lightly against the polished wood beside me. I was winding it. Harold hated when it fell behind. For the first time in days, genuine emotion flickered across Vanessa's expression. Not grief. Concern. Very brief. Very controlled. But real. She recovered almost instantly and gave a small nod. Of course. Then she disappeared upstairs. I remained frozen near the staircase until I finally heard drawers opening inside the study above me. Only then did I quietly leave the house through the side entrance. The cold lake wind hit my face the moment I stepped outside. Gray clouds hung low over the water while dead leaves scraped across the stone pathway beside the bluff. My hand stayed buried inside my coat pockets the entire drive downtown. I kept touching the flash drive to reassure myself it was still there. 40 minutes later, I sat inside Mr. Collins' office while he read Harold's notarized letter beneath the glow of a brass desk lamp. The older attorney removed his glasses slowly after finishing the final page. His face had gone pale. "My God," he whispered. I said nothing. Outside his office window, snow had begun falling lightly across the city. Collins reached for the flash drive next and inserted it into his computer without another word. Several files opened immediately. Bank transfers. Recorded conversations. Scanned signatures. Then a video file appeared labeled December for private. Harold's face filled the screen moments later. He looked thinner than I remembered. Weaker. But his eyes remained sharp. "If this recording is being viewed," he said slowly, "then events unfolded exactly as I feared." Collins leaned closer toward the monitor while silence settled heavily through the office. "I want it clearly understood that Margaret Whitmore remains my sole intended beneficiary alongside Ethan. Any modifications removing her were made under pressure during periods when I was medicated and physically vulnerable." My throat tightened painfully hearing him say my name. Harold paused briefly on screen before continuing. "Vanessa repeatedly isolated me during recovery and discouraged private meetings with legal counsel. If ownership transfers occurred without Margaret's knowledge, they should be investigated immediately." The video ended quietly. Collins stared at the blank screen for several long seconds before turning toward me. "Margaret," he said carefully, "this changes everything." I looked down at my wedding ring resting against the edge of the desk. For days I had felt like a ghost drifting through my own life while Vanessa slowly erased me room by room. But now, sitting inside that office with Harold's voice still echoing faintly in my mind, something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not revenge. Clarity. Harold had not left me helpless after all. He had left me the truth. And somewhere across the city, Vanessa still believed she had already won.